Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Vegeta discovered the truth and lost his pride? Subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And also check the description. So let's begin the story. The gravity chamber hummed with the mechanical precision of a heartbeat, steady, relentless, indifferent to the figure moving within its confines. 500 times Earth's gravity pressed down on Vegeta's frame, a pressure that would have crushed ordinary bone to powder, liquefied organs, compressed flesh into something unrecognizable. For him, it was Tuesday. His fist cut through the air with surgical precision, creating a sonic boom that rattled the reinforced walls. Pivot, strike, retreat. The kata was one he performed 1,000 times, 10,000, each repetition supposedly sharpening the blade of his technique until it could cut through dimensions themselves. His body moved through the forms with the fluency of a language he'd spoken since childhood, each movement a word in a dialect of violence he'd mastered before most could walk. But tonight something felt wrong. The satisfaction that usually accompanied perfection, that fierce, burning vindication that came with knowing he'd executed a technique flawlessly, was absent. Hollow. He'd achieved the impossible again today during training with Kakarot, had pushed his power to heights that should have been unattainable, had actually forced the younger Saiyan to retreat and recalibrate his approach. It should have felt like triumph. It should have tasted like validation, like all those years of grinding himself against impossibility until impossibility broke. Instead, it felt like smoke slipping through his fingers. Vegeta increased the gravity to 600 times normal, feeling his bones creak with the adjustment, the pleasant burn in his muscles as they adapted to the new pressure. Pain was honest. Pain didn't lie or disappoint. Pain was simply information, the body's way of cataloging damage, measuring limits, mapping the boundaries between possible and impossible. He'd spent his entire life pushing those boundaries further out, expanding the definition of what a Saiyan could achieve. But why? The question surfaced unbidden, unwelcome, and he crushed it immediately with a combination that would have shattered a mountain. His ki flared golden for a moment, Super Saiyan transformation rippling across his skin like lightning seeking ground, then faded back to base form. Even that, the power that had once represented the pinnacle of Saiyan achievement, the legendary transformation that occurred once every 1,000 years, even that felt routine now. Mechanical. He could slip in and out of the form as easily as breathing, could stack transformations on top of each other like a child building blocks, could reach heights of power that would have made the warriors of old weep with despair. And it meant nothing. No, that wasn't quite right. It meant something. It had to mean something. He was Vegeta, prince of all Saiyans, heir to a warrior legacy that stretched back millennia. Every moment of suffering under Frieza's boot, every humiliation endured, every ounce of rage and hatred and burning determination, all of it had been fuel for the fire that drove him forward. Surpass Kakarot, reclaim the pride of his race. Stand at the apex of power where he belonged by birthright and achievement both. He'd done it. Multiple times now, if he was being honest. There had been moments, fleeting but undeniable, where he'd reached heights even Kakarot couldn't match. The satisfaction should have been absolute. So why did it feel like grasping at shadows? Vegeta ended the training sequence abruptly, the gravity chamber's hum dropping to a lower register as he powered down the systems. Sweat slicked his skin, his GI was torn in several places from the intensity of his own techniques, and his muscles sang with the pleasant exhaustion of a body pushed to its limits. This should have been enough. This had always been enough before. He stood in the center of the chamber, breathing controlled despite the exertion, and stared at his reflection in the polished metal of the wall. Dark eyes stared back, hard and unyielding, the eyes of a warrior who never allowed himself the luxury of weakness. The widow's peak of his hairline was as sharp as ever, the set of his jaw as uncompromising as granite. He looked like a prince. Like a warrior. Like someone who knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. The reflection was a liar. Dinner at Capsule Corporation was a study in contrasts that would have been amusing if Vegeta had possessed any capacity for humor at the moment. The dining room was a masterpiece of modern design, all clean lines and expensive materials, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of West City's glittering skyline. Bulma had designed it herself, naturally, because she designed everything in this place, every corner of the sprawling complex bearing her fingerprints in one way or another. She sat across from him now, talking about something involving quantum fluctuations and dimensional stability, her hands moving expressively as she explained whatever new project was consuming her attention. Bulma was always working on something new, always pushing boundaries in her own way, reshaping reality through science with the same determination he used to reshape it through power. It was one of the things he'd never admit he admired about her, that restless drive, that refusal to accept limits. Trunks was picking at his food, clearly distracted by something on his phone, the faint glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes. Their son, still a strange thought even after all these years, looked more like Bulma than him, though he had the Saiyan hair and build. The boy was powerful, probably more naturally gifted than Vegeta had been at that age, though he lacked the killer instinct that had defined Vegeta's own youth. A mercy, perhaps. Or a weakness. He wasn't sure anymore. You're not listening to a word I'm saying, are you? Bulma's voice cut through his thoughts with the precision of a scalpel. Her blue eyes were fixed on him with that particular expression she got when she was analyzing something, the scientist's gaze that could dissect a problem down to its component parts. He'd been on the receiving end of that look often enough to recognize it. I'm listening, he said, which was technically true in that he'd heard the sounds she was making, even if the meaning had failed to penetrate. What did I just say? Vegeta reached for his water, buying time. Something about quantum fluctuations. That was 5 minutes ago. She set down her fork with a deliberate clink against the plate. What's wrong? Nothing is wrong, right? And I'm a natural blonde. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, the universal posture of a woman preparing to extract information through sheer force of will. You've been distracted all week. You came back from training with Goku 3 days ago, and you've barely said 10 words. You're training longer hours, sleeping less, and you haven't insulted anyone or picked a fight in at least 48 hours. For you, that's practically a medical emergency. Trunks looked up from his phone, suddenly interested. Great. An audience for his inadequacy. I'm fine, Vegeta said, injecting as much finality into the words as possible. Simply focused on training. You're always focused on training. This is different. Bulma's eyes narrowed, and he could practically see the gears turning behind them. Did something happen? Did Goku say something stupid? Did Whis mention some new transformation you haven't mastered yet? How could he explain it to her? How could he articulate the hollow feeling that had been growing in his chest like a tumor, the sense that everything he'd built his identity upon was somehow insufficient? She wouldn't understand. She'd built her own identity from nothing, had never needed the weight of legacy and bloodline to define her worth. She was brilliant because she was brilliant, not because some ancestral lineage demanded it of her. There's nothing to discuss, he said finally, standing from the table despite having barely touched his food. I have work to do. At 9 at night? Science doesn't keep business hours. Surely you of all people understand that. He left before she could formulate a response, ignoring the concerned look Trunks shot him, ignoring the way Bulma's frustration and worry tangled together in an expression he knew far too well. Guilt flickered briefly. She didn't deserve his evasiveness. She'd never been anything but honest with him, but he crushed it. Some things couldn't be shared, even with her. Especially with her. He found himself in Dr. Brief's laboratory without having consciously decided to go there. Muscle memory, perhaps, or instinct, or simply the mind's way of seeking distraction when internal contemplation became unbearable. The old man's workspace was a monument to genius and chaos in equal measure. Workbenches covered in half-disassembled technology, blueprints pinned to every available surface, the faint smell of machine oil and ozone permeating the air. Dr. Brief himself was long retired from active work, spending most of his time with his grandchildren or tinkering with personal projects. But his laboratory remained largely untouched. Bulma had mentioned wanting to organize it, to catalog and preserve her father's life work, but she'd never quite gotten around to it. Too many other projects demanding her attention, too many new frontiers to explore rather than dwelling on the past. Vegeta moved through the space with careful steps, mindful of the organized chaos around him. He wasn't entirely sure what had drawn him here. It wasn't as though the old scientist had possessed any special insight into Saiyan culture or warrior philosophy. If anything, Dr. Brief had represented everything Vegeta had once viewed with contempt: the soft, civilian mindset of a species that had never needed to fight for survival, that took peace for granted the way others took air or water. Funny how perspective shifted. What he'd once seen as weakness, he now recognized as simply a different kind of strength. Dr. Brief had created miracles with his mind, had reshaped human civilization through innovation, had built an empire not through conquest but through offering something valuable. There was a power in that, even if it wasn't the kind Vegeta had been raised to respect. A bank of storage units lined one wall, each labeled with characteristic Brief family precision. Most were marked with technical specifications or project names that meant nothing to Vegeta, but one caught his eye, partly because it was different from the others. Older, the label handwritten rather than printed, the capsule case showing signs of age. Saiyan technology, recovered materials classified. Vegeta's hand moved toward it before his mind fully registered the decision. The storage unit was locked, but the mechanism was designed to keep out casual curiosity, not a determined Saiyan prince with the ability to vaporize the entire building if he so chose. A precise application of key to the lock's internal mechanism, and it clicked open with a satisfied sound. Inside were several smaller capsule cases, each meticulously labeled. Most contained what he'd expect: armor fragments, broken scouters, weapons technology from the Frisia Force era, archaeological artifacts of a dead civilization, preserved by the family of the woman who'd given him a home when he'd had nothing else. But one case was different. The capsule inside pulsed with a faint, barely perceptible energy signature. Vegeta's instincts, honed by decades of combat and survival, immediately identified it as Saiyan in origin. Not just technology, but something with active power systems, something that had been waiting. The label read Saiyan Pod Data Core Piri Destruction ERA Military Encryption. His hands trembled as he picked up the capsule, a reaction so foreign and unacceptable that he nearly dropped it out of sheer spite at his own weakness. Pre-destruction era. That meant this data core had been created before Frisia had destroyed planet Vegeta, before the Saiyan race had been reduced to a handful of scattered survivors. Before everything had ended. Where had Dr. Brief gotten this? How long had it been sitting in this laboratory, dormant and waiting? Vegeta tried to remember if the old man had ever mentioned it, but came up blank. Perhaps it had been recovered from one of the many Saiyan pods that had landed on Earth over the years. Raditz pod maybe, or even his own. The thought that something like this had been here all along, while he'd been ignorant of its existence, felt like a personal failing. He should leave it alone. Should put it back, seal the storage unit, forget he'd ever seen it. What could the past possibly offer him now? The Saiyans were gone, their civilization dust scattered across the cosmos, their legacy reduced to a handful of survivors and half-breed children who would never know what they'd lost. Dwelling on it served no purpose, but his fingers were already activating the capsule. The data core materialized with a soft pop of displaced air, a sphere roughly the size of his head, its surface a dark metal etched with the flowing script of ancient Saiyan technical notation. Power ports studded its equator, and a holographic projection array dominated its northern hemisphere. The thing hummed with latent energy, systems activating after decades of dormancy, responding to the presence of Saiyan biology the way a flower responds to sunlight. Vegeta found a clear space on one of the workbenches and set the data core down with a reverence that would have embarrassed him if anyone had been present to witness it. His hands moved across the activation sequence from memory, muscle memory from his youth, from the days when he'd been groomed to inherit command of the Saiyan military, when such technical knowledge had been considered essential for a prince. The holographic interface flickered to life, displaying a menu in High Saiyan script. Most of it was standard: ship logs, military dispatches, technical specifications. But one file stood out, isolated from the others by multiple layers of encryption, each seal bearing the royal crest of the Vegeta line. Eyes only King Vegeta personal record final hours. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. Final hours. That meant this had been recorded just before the destruction, in those last moments when his father must have known what was coming. Vegeta had been a child then, too young to understand the politics and machinations that had led to their race's extinction. He'd been spared the knowledge of those final days, sent away on a mission that had conveniently kept him off planet when Frisia had made his move. He should leave this alone. Should destroy the data core and forget it existed. The past was dead, and whatever his father had chosen to record in those final hours couldn't change anything. The Saiyans were gone. His father was dead. Planet Vegeta was an expanding cloud of debris and frozen corpses somewhere in the cosmos. Knowing what King Vegeta had thought or felt or known in those last moments would serve no purpose except to open old wounds. But Vegeta's hand was already moving toward the encryption seal, already feeding his key into the biometric lock, already betraying every instinct that screamed at him to stop. The first layer of encryption dissolved with a pulse of green light. Then the second. The third required a DNA sample, which the core extracted through some mechanism he didn't bother to analyze. The fourth required him to speak his name, his full name, in high Saiyan formal declaration, the words tasting like ash and pride in equal measure. Vegeta, son of King Vegeta, prince of all Saiyans, heir to the throne of planet Vegeta. The final seal broke with a sound like breaking glass, and the holographic interface expanded, filling the space above the workbench with light and sound. His father appeared before him. Not a memory, not a photograph, but a three-dimensional recording of King Vegeta in his private chambers, the royal apartments Vegeta barely remembered from his childhood. The king wore his armor, but it was scored and damaged, dried blood visible on one shoulder. His face, so like Vegeta's own, the genetic legacy undeniable, was haggard, eyes shadowed with exhaustion and something else. Something that looked uncomfortably like fear. If you're viewing this, my son, then I am dead, and you have survived. The king's voice was rough, strained, nothing like the commanding boom Vegeta remembered from official ceremonies. This was a man at the end of his rope, speaking in the quiet tones of someone who knew they were running out of time. I had hoped to destroy this record before it became necessary, but events have accelerated beyond my control. You deserve to know the truth, even if knowing it damns me in your eyes. Especially if it damns me. Vegeta's body had gone very still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence, every muscle locked and waiting. He wanted to shut it off, wanted to destroy the data core and pretend this moment had never happened. But he couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from the image of his father, couldn't do anything but watch and listen as the dead spoke. Frieza plans to destroy our planet. Within hours, possibly minutes of this recording, he will annihilate planet Vegeta and every Saiyan on it. King Vegeta's jaw clenched, and for a moment he looked away from the recording device, as though unable to meet even the projected gaze of his future son. I know this because I helped create the conditions that made it possible. I know this because I negotiated the terms of our extinction, believing I was ensuring our survival. No. The word formed in Vegeta's mind but went no further, trapped behind clenched teeth, behind the iron discipline that kept him standing when every instinct screamed to flee or fight or destroy something. Anything to make this stop being real. I need you to understand the situation we faced. His father continued, each word measured and deliberate, as though he'd rehearsed this confession 1,000 times. The Saiyans were strong, but we were not strong enough to oppose Frieza directly. His power exceeded anything in our legends, and his empire spanned half the known galaxy. We were useful to him, brutal, efficient, willing to commit atrocities that even his other soldiers balked at. We carved a place for ourselves in his organization through sheer savagery. The king's hands, visible at the edge of the holographic frame, were shaking. Vegeta had never seen his father's hands shake. The king had been a pillar of absolute confidence, a warrior who'd never shown weakness, never betrayed doubt. Seeing this evidence of human, of Saiyan, frailty was somehow more disturbing than any of the words being spoken. But useful servants are still servants. Frieza feared us, as he should have. He knew that if we ever united against him, if we ever overcame our internal divisions and focused our power, we could threaten his empire. So he came to me with a proposition, 3 years before the destruction. A deal, 3 years. Vegeta's mind reeled. 3 years his father had lived with this knowledge, had maintained the facade of royal authority, had sent Saiyans on missions knowing what was coming. He offered me a choice, the extinction of the Saiyan race, or the preservation of select bloodlines under conditions of absolute loyalty. The royal line would be spared. The elite warriors, those who'd proven their worth and usefulness, would be preserved. Perhaps a few dozen individuals in total. The rest. King Vegeta's voice cracked, just slightly, a hairline fracture in his composure. The rest would die. Cleanly, quickly, the planet destroyed so thoroughly that there would be nothing left to mourn. Vegeta's legs chose that moment to give out, depositing him onto a nearby stool with none of the grace he usually commanded. The hologram continued, oblivious to its audience's distress. I told myself I was being pragmatic. That saving some of our race was better than saving none. That the Saiyan legacy could continue through you, through Nappa, through the handful of others deemed worthy of preservation. I convinced myself that I was making the hard choice, the necessary sacrifice, the decision a true king would make when faced with impossible odds. King Vegeta laughed then, a sound so bitter and broken that it barely qualified as laughter at all. I was a fool. A coward. I chose the survival of my bloodline over the survival of my people. I condemned millions to death because I couldn't bear the thought of the royal line ending with me. And I told myself it was strategy, that it was leadership, that it was the burden of command. The king leaned forward, his face filling the holographic frame, eyes blazing with an intensity that reminded Vegeta of every moment he'd pushed himself past his limits. But Frieza lied, as tyrants always do. The conditions he demanded grew harsher, the restrictions on our autonomy tighter. He wanted complete subservience, wanted us to become nothing more than trained animals who performed on command. And I realized, too late, that he'd never intended to honor the deal at all. He would keep us alive only as long as we were useful, only as long as we posed no threat. The moment we showed any sign of independence, any hint of rebellion, he would eliminate us as thoroughly as he planned to eliminate the rest of our race. The king straightened, and something shifted in his expression, determination hardening into resolve. So I attempted to renegotiate, to demand better terms, to threaten rebellion if he didn't provide guarantees. I thought I had leverage, thought he needed us enough to compromise. Another laugh, this one edged with hysteria. Instead, I accelerated the timetable. He's coming tonight, my son. He's coming to finish what I started, to punish me for my presumption by destroying everything I tried to save. Vegeta couldn't breathe. The air in the laboratory had turned to concrete in his lungs, pressing down with more force than 600 times gravity, crushing something vital in his chest. I've sent you away on a mission because I don't know what else to do. If you're watching this, it means Frieza spared you despite my betrayal, which means he still sees value in keeping you alive. Use that. Survive, whatever it takes. Grow strong enough that no one can ever make you choose between your pride and your survival. The king's hand reached toward the recording device, ready to end the transmission, but he paused. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve the title of king, or father, or warrior. I'm a traitor who bartered away his people for the illusion of control. But you, my son, you carry the name Vegeta now. You'll be the last of our line, the final bearer of our legacy. Don't let it be a legacy of cowardice. Don't let the Saiyan race be remembered only for their final king's weakness. The hologram flickered, the king's image beginning to dissolve. Be better than I was. Be the prince we needed instead of the king we deserved. The transmission ended, the laboratory falling into sudden, absolute silence. The data core's hum seemed impossibly loud in the aftermath, a mechanical heartbeat marking the seconds, the minutes, the eternity that Vegeta sat frozen on the stool, staring at the empty space where his father's confession had hung in the air. His mind was working frantically, pulling up memories, recontextualizing everything he'd ever known about his childhood, about Frieza, about the destruction of planet Vegeta. Things that had never quite made sense suddenly slotted into place with sickening clarity. The way Frieza had always been particularly vicious toward him, more than could be explained by simple sadism. That was personal. That was punishment for his father's attempted betrayal, a constant reminder that the royal line survived only at Frieza's pleasure. The missions he'd been sent on as a child, always away from the main Saiyan forces, always with Nappa and Raditz, always to places that kept them isolated. Not punishment or training, but preservation, keeping the useful survivors scattered, controlled, unable to unite or pose a threat. The way other Saiyans had looked at him in those final days before the destruction, expressions he'd interpreted as respect or fear but now recognized as something else entirely. They'd known. Some of them must have known about his father's deal, about the betrayal, about who would survive and who wouldn't. His entire life had been built on a foundation of lies and mass graves. Every moment of pride in his heritage, every time he proclaimed himself prince of all Saiyans, every instant he believed himself heir to a noble warrior legacy, all of it had been a joke. A sick cosmic jest. His father hadn't died fighting Frieza in a desperate last stand, as Vegeta had always been told. He died because he tried to renegotiate the terms of genocide after already condemning his people to death. And Vegeta had survived because his father had purchased his life with the blood of millions. The data core sat on the workbench, its surface reflecting the laboratory's dim lighting, innocent and damning in equal measure. Vegeta stared at it for a long time, his mind churning through implications and revelations, each one worse than the last. He could destroy it. Should destroy it. Blast the thing to atoms and scatter the atoms across dimensions where they could never be recovered. Pretend this night had never happened, that he'd never seen his father's confession, that the comfortable lies he'd been living with for decades were still intact. But he didn't move. Couldn't move. His body felt like it belonged to someone else, a stranger wearing his skin, going through the motions of breathing and existing while the real Vegeta had been hollowed out and left empty. How long he sat there, he couldn't say. Long enough for the laboratory's automatic systems to cycle the lighting down to night mode. Long enough for his legs to go numb from maintaining the same position. Long enough for the initial shock to calcify into something else. Something darker and more dangerous. When he finally stood, his movements were mechanical, each gesture precisely controlled because any loss of control might lead to the destruction of everything within a 100-mile radius. He carefully deactivated the data core, returned it to its capsule, and placed it back in the storage unit with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. The walk back through Capsule Corp was a blur. He registered details, the empty hallways, the faint blue glow of night lights, the distant sound of Bulma working in her own laboratory. But none of it penetrated the numb fog that had settled over his thoughts. He found himself in the bedroom he shared with Bulma without consciously navigating there. She was still awake, reading something on a tablet, her blue hair spilling across the pillow in a way that would have distracted him under normal circumstances. She looked up as he entered, her expression shifting from surprise to concern in the space of a heartbeat. Vegeta? It's past midnight. Where were you? He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw everything he didn't deserve. The brilliant scientist who'd chosen to build a life with a mass murderer. The woman who'd given him a home, a family, a reason to exist beyond revenge and rage. The person who'd believed he could be more than the weapon Frieza had forged from his father's betrayal. She didn't know. Couldn't know. How could he possibly explain to her that every moment of his existence had been purchased with genocide? That his entire identity was built on a foundation of collaboration with the monster who'd enslaved him? That the pride he'd clung to for decades, the legacy he'd fought to preserve, was nothing more than the delusion of a traitor's son. I was working, he said, his voice coming out flat, emotionless, dead. Lost track of time. Bulma set the tablet aside, her blue eyes searching his face with that analytical precision that missed nothing. Something's wrong. Talk to me, he wanted to. The words sat in his throat, acid and bile and truth that would burn everything it touched. But they wouldn't come. How could they? She'd look at him differently if she knew. They'd all look at him differently. Trunks, Kakarot, all of them, they'd see him for what he really was. Not a prince, not a warrior, not even a survivor, just the last pathetic remnant of a bloodline that had betrayed its people for a few more years of existence. I'm fine, he said, and the lie tasted like ashes. Just tired. He moved toward the bathroom, needing space, needing distance, needing anything that would stop her from looking at him with those eyes that saw too much. But Bulma was already sliding out of bed, already moving toward him with that determined set to her shoulders that meant she wasn't going to let this go. Vegeta, please. You can tell me anything. You know that. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles white with the effort of maintaining control. Could he? Could he really tell her anything? Could he explain that the man she'd built a life with was a fraud? That every moment of pride and certainty she'd witnessed was built on a lie so fundamental that it poisoned everything it touched? Bulma, the word stuck, caught between his pride and his need, between the truth and the comfortable fiction. I need to sleep. We'll talk tomorrow. It was another lie. They wouldn't talk tomorrow, because tomorrow he'd have to maintain the facade, would have to pretend he was still the person he'd been yesterday, before his father's confession had stripped away every comfortable delusion. She watched him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then nodded slowly. Okay. Tomorrow. He escaped to the bathroom, shutting the door with more force than necessary, and braced his hands against the sink. His reflection stared back at him from the mirror. Same face, same eyes, same widow's peak that marked him as his father's son. But now all he could see was King Vegeta's haggard expression, the fear and desperation in eyes that should have been fearless. How much of his father was in him? How much of that cowardice, that willingness to sacrifice others for personal survival, ran in his blood? He'd done terrible things under Frisia's command, had destroyed civilizations without a second thought. At the time, he told himself he was surviving, that he was biding his time until he could claim his revenge. But how different was that from his father's justifications? How many of those worlds had died because King Vegeta had made a deal with the devil? Vegeta's grip on the sink tightened until the porcelain cracked, hairline fractures spreading from where his fingers pressed into the surface. He forced himself to release it, to step back, to maintain the iron control that had kept him alive through decades of hell. But inside, where no one could see, something fundamental had broken. The certainty that had always defined him, the absolute conviction in his identity, his purpose, his worth, had been shattered as thoroughly as Frisia had shattered planet Vegeta. He was Vegeta, prince of all Saiyans, heir to a legacy of betrayal and genocide. And he had no idea who that made him anymore. The night stretched on with the quality of a waking nightmare, time moving both too slowly and too quickly, each minute an eternity, and yet the hours bleeding together into an indistinct smear of darkness and dread. Vegeta lay beside Bulma, feeling the warmth of her body mere inches away, a gulf that might as well have been light years for all the connection he could muster. Her breathing had settled into the deep, steady rhythm of sleep, but his own remained shallow, controlled, the breath of someone maintaining discipline even as everything inside threatened to come apart. His mind wouldn't stop working, couldn't stop replaying his father's words, couldn't stop reconstructing his entire existence through this new, poisonous lens. Every memory he'd ever cherished now felt contaminated, each moment of pride or certainty revealed as built on foundations of sand and bones. He remembered being 5 years old, watching his father review military reports in the throne room. The king had seemed impossibly large then, a figure of absolute authority, his commands reshaping the galaxy with casual gestures. Vegeta had stood at his father's side, small hands clasped behind his back in imitation of royal bearing, absorbing every detail of leadership and command. His father had paused in his work to ruffle Vegeta's hair, a rare moment of paternal affection, and said, "One day, my son, all of this will be yours to command." All of what? A empire purchased through genocide? A throne built on the corpses of their own people? Another memory surfaced, unbidden, his 7th birthday, when his father had presented him with his first set of royal armor. The ceremony had been formal, witnessed by the elite guard and the highest-ranking warriors. King Vegeta had placed the armor on his son's shoulders with his own hands, each piece a symbol of inheritance and destiny. "You are the future of our race," his father had proclaimed, voice carrying through the assembled crowd. "Never forget what you represent." Vegeta's hands clenched in the sheets. He'd worn that armor with such pride, had believed himself the bearer of a sacred trust, the continuation of an unbroken warrior lineage stretching back millennia. But now he understood the subtext, the unspoken truth beneath his father's words. He represented the survivors, yes, but survivors purchased at the cost of everyone else's extinction. His future had been bartered for with the lives of millions who'd had no say in the transaction. How many low-class Saiyans had died never knowing their prince's bloodline had been deemed worth saving while theirs had not? The question burned like acid. He thought of Raditz and Nappa, his companions in the years after planet Vegeta's destruction. They'd been part of the select few, the useful warriors deemed worthy of preservation. Had they known? Had they understood that they'd survived not through strength or merit, but because King Vegeta had negotiated their lives into his devil's bargain with Frisia? Nappa was dead now, killed by Vegeta's own hand in a fit of rage after their defeat on Earth. At the time, it had felt like strength, eliminating weakness, refusing to tolerate failure. But now the memory tasted different. He'd killed one of the last survivors of his father's deal, one of the few who might have been able to confirm or deny the truth of what had happened. Had that been subconscious instinct? Some part of him recognizing that Nappa represented uncomfortable questions he didn't want answered. Raditz, too, was gone, killed by Kakarot and Piccolo in the very first confrontation that had brought the wider universe crashing down on Earth's peaceful existence. Vegeta had barely spared his distant cousin a thought when he'd learned of the death. Raditz had been weak, incompetent, unworthy of the Saiyan name. But now he wondered, what had Raditz known? What stories might he have carried about those final days before the destruction? All the witnesses were dead or scattered. Only Vegeta remained, sole bearer of a truth he discovered by accident, keeper of a secret that poisoned everything it touched. Beside him, Bulma shifted in her sleep, one hand reaching out unconsciously to rest against his arm. The contact was warm, grounding, achingly human in its simple affection. She trusted him absolutely, had built a life with him despite knowing the depths of his past crimes, despite understanding exactly what kind of monster he'd been under Frieza's command. She'd looked at all of that darkness and chosen him anyway, had somehow seen something worth redeeming beneath the layers of rage and pride and violence. But she didn't know this. Didn't know that his entire identity was founded on a lie, that the prince she'd chosen to love was nothing more than the beneficiary of his father's betrayal. Would she still look at him the same way if she knew? The thought was intolerable, so he pushed it away, forced his mind toward other channels, other concerns. But every path led back to the same central revelation, the same inescapable truth. He was not who he'd believed himself to be, and everything he'd built his sense of self upon was a carefully constructed fiction. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the bedroom windows with the reluctance of a condemned man approaching the gallows. Vegeta had not slept, though he'd maintained the facade well enough that Bulma hadn't woken during the night. When her alarm chimed softly, she stirred against him, pressing closer for a moment before consciousness fully returned. "Morning," she mumbled, her voice rough with sleep, and he felt her press a kiss to his shoulder, casual, affectionate, the kind of gesture that came from years of shared intimacy. "Morning," he managed, the word feeling foreign in his mouth. She pulled away, stretching, and he felt the loss of her warmth like a physical ache. "I've got a meeting with the development team at 9, she said, already shifting into her workday mindset, the scientist's focus replacing the softer edges of sleep. "But we should talk tonight. Really talk, not whatever evasion you were planning." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and she seemed to accept that as agreement. She moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. Shower, breakfast, the careful application of makeup that she claimed she didn't need but wore anyway because she enjoyed it. He watched her from the periphery, cataloging details as though seeing her for the first time, or perhaps the last time, though he couldn't articulate why that particular dread had settled in his chest. When she left, pausing to kiss him goodbye with a lingering concern in her eyes that said she knew something was deeply wrong but would respect his space until he was ready to share it, the apartment felt cavernous, empty in a way that had nothing to do with physical occupation. Trunks had already left for his own training, some group session with Goten that Vegeta had approved without much thought. The boy was powerful enough to handle himself, and Goku's son was irritating but competent. They'd be fine. Which left Vegeta alone with his thoughts, a circumstance that would have been welcome yesterday but now felt like a trap, like being locked in a room with a ticking bomb and no way to defuse it. He should train. Should lose himself in the familiar rhythm of physical exertion, let the clarity of combat forms and key manipulation burn away the confusion and dread. But when he moved toward the gravity chamber, his feet carried him in a different direction instead, back toward Dr. Brief's laboratory. Back toward the data core that sat waiting like a coiled serpent. The laboratory was exactly as he'd left it, down to the crack in the workbench where he'd gripped it too tightly. Morning light filtered through high windows, illuminating dust motes and golden streams, lending the space an almost sacred quality that felt deeply inappropriate given what it contained. The storage unit opened easily. He'd broken the lock last night, and no one had been by to repair it. The data core's capsule sat exactly where he'd replaced it, innocent and damning in equal measure. His hands moved without conscious direction, retrieving it, activating it, setting the sphere on the workbench as its systems hummed to life. He told himself he was being thorough, that he needed to verify what he'd heard, that perhaps in the shock of discovery he'd misunderstood or misinterpreted his father's words. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was picking at a wound, unable to leave it alone, compulsively returning to the source of his pain as though repetition might somehow lessen its impact. The holographic interface materialized, menu options floating in high Saiyan script. He navigated past the file he'd accessed last night. He couldn't bear to hear his father's confession again, not yet, and began exploring the other data stored in the core. Technical specifications for Saiyan warships. Strategic assessments of various planetary targets. Communications logs from the final months before the destruction. Each file painted a picture of a civilization in decline, a warrior race that had traded independence for the dubious security of serving a tyrant. But it was the personnel files that made his hands still, hovering over the holographic controls as though frozen mid-gesture. Complete records of every Saiyan alive in those final months. Names, bloodlines, combat ratings, mission histories. Thousands upon thousands of entries, each one representing a life, an individual with their own history and aspirations and connections. The database was comprehensive in the way only military records could be, cold, efficient, reducing entire existences to data points and statistics. Vegeta found himself scrolling through them, reading names he'd never heard, studying faces of warriors who'd died before he was old enough to remember them. Low-class fighters, most of them, sent on the most dangerous missions, expendable in a way that elite warriors never were. Each entry included a status marker, and as he progressed through the database, a pattern emerged that made his stomach turn. Red markers indicated deceased, confirmed killed in action. Yellow markers indicated missing, presumed dead. Green markers indicated active status. And there was one other color, appearing with disturbing frequency in the final months. Blue markers, tagged with a designation that translated roughly as expendable asset, non-essential. The blue markers correlated almost perfectly with low-class warriors, those born without significant power levels, those whose bloodlines held no particular distinction. Thousands of them, all categorized as non-essential in the months leading up to the destruction. His father had been cataloging who would live and who would die. The realization hit with physical force, and Vegeta had to grip the workbench to steady himself. This wasn't just a deal made in desperation, wasn't just a terrible choice between bad options. This had been planned, organized, systematized. King Vegeta had spent months determining which Saiyans were worth saving, which bloodlines deserved to continue, which warriors provided enough utility to justify their continued existence, and he'd marked the rest for death. Vegeta pulled up the files for the essential personnel, those who'd been designated for survival. The list was small, brutally curated. Royal bloodline, obviously. Elite warriors like Nappa, whose raw power made them valuable. Technical specialists, a handful of scientists and engineers whose knowledge was deemed too valuable to lose. And then, anomalously, a few low-class warriors whose files indicated nothing particularly special about their abilities or lineage. He opened one at random, a fighter named Bardock, combat rating barely above average, no distinguished bloodline, no particular accomplishments that would mark him as elite. Yet his file was marked green, designated as essential, with a note in his father's own handwriting, maintains unusual prescient abilities. Potential value for strategic planning. Recommend preservation. Bardock. The name was familiar, though Vegeta couldn't immediately place why. He ran a search through the database, cross-referencing the name with other records, and froze when the connection materialized. Bardock, father of Kakarot. Father of Son Goku. The low-class warrior who'd somehow earned a place on King Vegeta's survival list had spawned the very Saiyan who'd become Vegeta's eternal rival, the standard against which he measured himself, the impossible benchmark of Saiyan achievement that had driven him to heights he never imagined possible. The irony was so bitter it almost qualified as cosmic punishment. He dug deeper into Bardock's file, looking for anything that might explain the designation. The prescient abilities were documented but unreliable, more like sporadic flashes than consistent foresight. Combat performance was solid but unremarkable. mission completion rate was average. There was nothing here that screamed essential, nothing that would warrant preservation over thousands of other warriors. Unless, Vegeta pulled up the mission logs, tracing Bardock's assignments in those final months. The warrior had been sent off-planet frequently, often on solo assignments, or with minimal support. Missions that kept him away from the main Saiyan population, isolated, controlled. The same pattern he noticed in his own assignments from that period. King Vegeta hadn't saved Bardock because he was valuable. He'd saved him because Kakarot was scheduled to be sent to Earth, part of some low-class infiltration program that would conveniently keep the infant off-planet when Frieza made his move. Bardock had been marked essential because his son was already being preserved, and leaving the father alive served the purpose of maintaining the fiction that this was all random chance rather than calculated selection. How many others on the survival list had been chosen not for their own merit but for these kinds of logistical considerations? How many had lived because some bureaucratic requirement demanded it, some need to maintain appearances or preserve the illusion that King Vegeta was simply trying to save who he could? Vegeta's fingers moved across the holographic interface, pulling up more files, more records, compulsively consuming information that only deepened the nausea building in his gut. Communications logs showed his father's negotiations with Frieza, the careful dance of terms and conditions, the gradual erosion of Saiyan autonomy in exchange for promised survival. One communication stood out, dated approximately 6 months before the destruction. From King Vegeta to Lord Frieza Re, amended terms. Your latest demands are unacceptable. The Saiyan elite require guarantees of autonomous command structure and freedom of movement beyond servile assignments. We are warriors, not slaves, and our continued service depends on maintaining our dignity and purpose. I propose the following amendments to our arrangement. The message continued, laying out various demands and counteroffers, all phrased in the careful language of someone trying to negotiate from a position of weakness while maintaining the appearance of strength. Vegeta recognized the tone. He'd used it himself when dealing with beings far more powerful, that careful balance between subservience and pride. The desperate attempt to claim some measure of dignity while acknowledging fundamental powerlessness. Frieza's response, when it came, was brief and devastating. From Lord Frieza to King Vegeta Re, amended terms. Your presumption is noted. Our arrangement was never negotiable, merely a courtesy extended to acknowledge your cooperation. You seem to have forgotten that I hold every card in this game, while you hold nothing but the lives of primitives I could exterminate with a gesture. Consider this your final warning, accept the terms as stated, or watch your precious bloodline burn with the rest of your pathetic race. You have 24 hours to respond. I look forward to your compliance. The message was timestamped 2 days before the destruction. 2 days between Frieza's ultimatum and the annihilation of an entire species. Vegeta pulled up the response logs, searching for his father's reply, and found only silence. King Vegeta had never responded, had never offered the compliance Frieza demanded, which meant Frieza had made good on his threat. But if that was true, why had Vegeta survived? Why had Nappa and Raditz been spared? If King Vegeta had defied Frieza's ultimatum, if he'd refused to accept the final terms, then by all logic the entire royal line should have been obliterated along with the rest of planet Vegeta, unless... Vegeta pulled up another set of files, these marked with the highest levels of encryption, military intelligence reports from Saiyan operatives embedded within Frieza's organization. The reports painted a picture of paranoia and calculation on both sides, each party maneuvering for advantage while pretending cooperation. One report, filed by an agent whose name had been redacted, detailed a conversation overheard in Frieza's inner sanctum. Lord Frieza discussed the Saiyan problem with his advisors. He expressed concern that complete extermination might create a power vacuum in certain sectors where Saiyan forces are currently maintaining control. Suggested solution: eliminate the majority to prevent future threat, but preserve a handful of individuals as controllable assets. Specific targets for preservation include the prince, valuable as hostage and symbol of broken pride, and select elite warriors, useful for missions requiring expendable brutality. The agent's commentary continued. Recommendation: this represents an opportunity. If Lord Frieza intends to spare select individuals, we may be able to influence the selection criteria to maximize survival of critical personnel. However, This would require King Vegeta to convincingly portray submission while secretly maintaining the appearance of defiance, a delicate balance that may prove impossible to sustain. The date on the report was 3 months before the destruction. 3 months his father had known that Frieza planned to spare some Saiyans regardless of negotiation outcomes. 3 months King Vegeta had continued his communications, his demands, his careful performance of attempted rebellion, all while knowing it was theater. The truth crystallized with horrifying clarity. His father hadn't been trying to save the Saiyan race. He'd been trying to control the narrative of its destruction. By appearing to defy Frieza, by making demands and threats, King Vegeta had ensured that when the tyrant made his move, it would look like retaliation rather than culling. The survivors, Vegeta, Nappa, Raditz, and a handful of others scattered across the galaxy, would appear to have been spared through luck or Frieza's casual cruelty rather than through their king's collaboration. King Vegeta had sacrificed his people not just for survival, but for the preservation of his legacy. He'd chosen to be remembered as a martyr rather than a collaborator, had orchestrated his own death to appear heroic while knowing all along that he'd sealed his people's fate through earlier negotiations. The hologram flickered as Vegeta's hands clenched, key spiking unconsciously, disrupting the data core's systems. He forced himself to breathe, to regain control, to pull his power back before he destroyed the evidence entirely. But the damage was done, not to the data core, but to something fundamental in his understanding of himself. Every story he'd been told about his father's final stand against Frieza was a carefully constructed lie. The proud warrior king, refusing to bow, dying with honor intact. That narrative had been manufactured, designed to inspire the survivors, to give them something to believe in even as they served the very tyrant who destroyed their world. And Vegeta had believed it absolutely. Had built his entire identity around it, had used it as fuel for decades of rage and determination and pride. The need to honor his father's sacrifice, to be worthy of the legacy, to reclaim what had been stolen, all of it had been based on fiction. He thought of all the times he'd invoked his father's memory, all the moments he'd drawn strength from imagining King Vegeta's final defiant stand. When Frieza had tortured him, when battles had pushed him to the edge of death, when he needed to find that last reserve of will to keep fighting, always, his father's supposed sacrifice had been there, a touchstone of pride and purpose. But it had all been lies. Comfortable lies, perhaps, lies that served a purpose, but lies nonetheless. The worst part was understanding why his father had done it. Not just to save himself, though that had certainly been part of it, but to preserve something for those who survived. If the truth had been known, if the handful of spared Saiyans had understood that their king had sold them all out, what would have happened? Would they have had anything left to fight for? Any pride left to sustain them through servitude under Frieza? King Vegeta had chosen to be remembered as a hero rather than a traitor, had constructed an elaborate fiction to give the survivors something to believe in, even if it meant deceiving his own son about the fundamental nature of their existence. It was, in its own twisted way, a kind of paternal love. Or perhaps just the final act of a desperate man trying to find meaning in inevitable tragedy. Vegeta wasn't sure which interpretation was worse. He stood there for a long time, surrounded by the ghosts of his people, the holographic interface casting pale light across his face as morning turned to afternoon. The laboratory was silent except for the soft hum of the data core, and he found himself wondering if this was how his father had felt in those final hours, surrounded by secrets and lies, watching as everything he tried to preserve crumbled despite his best efforts. The data core contained other files, other revelations waiting to be uncovered. Part of him wanted to keep digging, to excavate every last truth until nothing remained hidden. But another part, the part that still felt dangerously close to breaking, recognized that he'd already learned more than he could process, that each new revelation was another weight added to a burden that might eventually crush him entirely. So he closed the interface, deactivated the data core, and stood in the empty laboratory as dust motes danced in the afternoon light. Outside, he could hear the distant sounds of West City, traffic voices, the normal sounds of a civilization at peace, people going about their lives with no concept of the weight of legacy, or the poison of inherited guilt. He thought of Bulma, probably deep in her meeting by now, discussing technical specifications and development timelines with the kind of focused intensity she brought to everything she cared about. He thought of Trunks, training with Goten, the two of them sparring with the casual confidence of young warriors who never known the weight of real desperation. Neither of them knew what he'd discovered. Neither of them could understand what it meant to have your entire identity revealed as a carefully constructed fiction, to realize that every moment of pride had been built on graves your father helped dig, and he still didn't know if he could tell them. The right thing, the honest thing, would be to share what he'd learned, to bring this secret into the light and deal with whatever consequences followed. But Vegeta had never been particularly good at doing the right thing, and the thought of seeing their reactions, of watching their perception of him shift as they understood what his survival had cost, felt insurmountable. So he stood in the laboratory, frozen between truth and fiction, between the past and whatever came next, and wondered who he would be when he finally forced himself to choose: the Saiyan Prince, or simply Vegeta, the heir to a warrior legacy, or the son of a traitor, the man he'd always believed himself to be, or the one he was only now beginning to understand. The weight of certainty, he realized, had been easier to bear than the weight of truth, but there was no going back now, no way to unknow what he'd learned, no returning to the comfortable fictions that had sustained him for so long. He had discovered the truth, and in doing so, had lost everything. The obsession crept in gradually, like frost spreading across a window, imperceptible at first, then suddenly comprehensive, transforming everything it touched into something crystalline and brittle. Vegeta told himself he was simply being thorough, that understanding the full scope of his father's betrayal was a strategic necessity, that knowledge was power and ignorance was weakness. But the truth, had he been willing to acknowledge it, was simpler and more damning. He couldn't stop. 3 days had passed since he'd first activated the data core, and in that time, the laboratory had become his sanctum and his prison. He'd set up a secondary workstation in the corner, pulled in a chair that had probably cost more than most people's cars, and systematically begun excavating every fragment of information the Saiyan archives contained. Files sprawled across multiple holographic displays, personnel records, communications logs, tactical assessments, historical databases. Each one opened new questions, revealed new layers to the conspiracy his father had orchestrated. He barely slept. When exhaustion forced him to close his eyes, he'd find himself back at the workstation within hours, drawn by the compulsion to know more, to understand completely, to map every corner of the lie his life had been built upon. Food became an afterthought, consumed mechanically when Bulma forced something into his hands, taste and nutrition secondary to the need to continue his research. The gravity chamber sat unused, its silence an accusation. He'd always trained religiously, obsessively, using physical exertion as both meditation and therapy. But now the thought of entering that space, of going through those familiar forms, filled him with something approaching revulsion. What was the point? Every technique he'd perfected, every transformation he'd mastered, every moment of warrior's pride, all of it had been built on foundations of sand and bones. Bulma noticed, of course. She always noticed. But her attempts at intervention grew increasingly frustrated as he deflected her concerns with monosyllabic responses and strategic absences. He could see the worry in her eyes during the brief moments they occupied the same space, could feel her desire to help warring with her respect for his privacy. It would have been touching if he'd possessed any emotional capacity left to be touched. Trunks had stopped by the laboratory twice, ostensibly to ask training-related questions, but really, Vegeta knew, to check on his father at Bulma's request. The boy was transparent in a way that would have been endearing under other circumstances. But Vegeta had sent him away both times with curt dismissals that felt cruel even as he delivered them. Better to push them away now than let them witness what he was becoming. This hollow thing wearing Vegeta's face. This archaeologist of his own demolished identity. The data core contained decades of accumulated intelligence, and Vegeta consumed it with the focused intensity he'd once reserved for combat. Communications between King Vegeta and various faction leaders within Saiyan society revealed a political landscape far more complex than the simple warrior hierarchy he'd been taught. There had been dissenters, nobles who'd questioned the increasingly close relationship with Frieza, low-class fighters who'd organized into something resembling a resistance movement. All of them had been silenced, one way or another. Some had died in training accidents. Others had been sent on suicide missions disguised as strategic deployments. A few had simply disappeared, their names struck from official records as though they'd never existed. His father had systematically eliminated every voice that might have complicated his plans, had consolidated power while maintaining the fiction of a unified warrior race standing proud against external threats. One file in particular made Vegeta's hands still over the holographic controls, his breath catching in his throat despite himself. Incident Report. Lower District Uprising Date. 18 months Piri Destruction filed by Royal Guard Commander Nappa. Approximately 2,000 low-class warriors gathered in the Lower District Market Square to protest recent policy changes regarding mission assignments and resource distribution. The gathering was peaceful initially, but rhetoric grew increasingly seditious as speakers questioned King Vegeta's leadership and his relationship with Lord Frieza's organization. Per standing orders, Royal Guard units were deployed to disperse the gathering. Protesters refused dispersal commands and formed defensive positions. Situation escalated when several high-ranking officers joined the protesters, lending legitimacy to their grievances. King Vegeta personally intervened, arriving via attack pod to demonstrate authority. He addressed the crowd, offered assurances that their concerns would be heard, promised reforms to mission assignment protocols. Protesters dispersed peacefully following royal address. Classified addendum. Eyes only royal authorization. Following dispersal, surveillance identified 47 individuals as primary organizers and agitators. Per King's direct order, all 47 were marked for strategic reassignment. Over subsequent weeks, targeted individuals were deployed on high-risk solo missions with deliberately insufficient intelligence support. All 47 confirmed killed in action within 60 days of initial incident. Additional 200 individuals identified as active participants in protests were reassigned to frontier sectors with reduced supply line access. Attrition rate among this group, 73% over 6-month period. King Vegeta's public address to the protesters has been distributed through official channels as evidence of royal concern for all Saiyan welfare. Actual disposition of organizers remains classified to preserve social stability. Vegeta read the report 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of calculated cruelty. His father hadn't just suppressed dissent, he'd weaponized hope, had offered compassion and reform as tools to identify threats, then systematically eliminated them while maintaining the appearance of benevolent leadership. 2,000 Saiyans had gathered peacefully to voice legitimate concerns about their king's policies. Fewer than half had survived to see planet Vegeta's destruction, and none of those deaths had been recorded as political executions. Just casualties of war, acceptable losses in the endless expansion of Frieza's empire. How many times had Vegeta himself invoked his father's supposed concern for all Saiyans, his dedication to their welfare regardless of class or bloodline? He believed those stories, had used them as evidence that the royal line represented something worth preserving, that beneath the brutality of Saiyan culture there existed a core of honor and loyalty to one's own people. But it had all been theater. Performance art designed to maintain control while pursuing an agenda that required the sacrifice of the very people his father had sworn to protect. The holographic display flickered as Vegeta's ki spiked involuntarily, power bleeding through his control in response to emotions he couldn't quite name. Rage would have been simple, pure, something he could channel and direct. But this wasn't rage. This was something colder, more corrosive, a sense of betrayal so fundamental it seemed to poison his connection to his own history. He forced his power back under control through decades of practiced discipline, watching the display stabilize as his energy signature normalized. The data remained unchanged by his emotional response, indifferent to his crisis. Truth didn't care about feelings, didn't adjust itself to be more palatable or comfortable. It simply existed, waiting to be discovered by those foolish or desperate enough to seek it. Vegeta stood from the workstation, his body protesting the movement after hours of stillness, muscles stiff and joints creaking in ways they hadn't since his youth. A glance at the laboratory's chronometer revealed it was past 3 in the morning. He'd missed dinner entirely, had ignored Bulma's increasingly pointed messages, had let another day dissolve into this obsessive excavation of uncomfortable truths. He should stop. Should shut down the data core, return to his family, pretend he was still the person they thought they knew. But his hands were already pulling up another file, already diving deeper into the archives, chasing the thread of his father's conspiracy to whatever bitter end awaited. The discovery came on the 4th day, buried in a subsection of files marked with encryption so dense that Vegeta had initially assumed they were corrupted data. But persistence, or obsession, the line had blurred beyond recognition, eventually cracked the security, revealing a trove of personal correspondence between his father and various confidants. Most of it was mundane, the kind of administrative minutiae that accompanied any position of power, but scattered throughout were messages that revealed the depth of King Vegeta's self-awareness, the degree to which he'd understood exactly what he was doing and chosen to proceed anyway. One message, addressed to a noble whose name had been redacted but whose position was listed as strategic advisor, stood out. "I know what you think of my decisions. I can see it in your eyes during council sessions. That mixture of horror and disbelief that you're not quite skilled enough to hide. You believe I've damned us all through my negotiations with Frisia, that I've traded our freedom for the illusion of survival. Perhaps you're right. But consider the alternative. Frisia destroys us all, immediately and completely, leaving nothing of Saiyan culture or legacy or achievement. We become a footnote in galactic history, a primitive warrior race that briefly troubled a tyrant before being casually exterminated. My way, at least some of us survive." The royal line continues. Elite warriors preserve their knowledge and techniques. When Frisia eventually falls, and he will fall, all tyrants do, there will still be Saiyans to reclaim what was stolen. Is it cowardice to choose survival over honorable extinction? Perhaps. But I am a king before I am a warrior, and a king's first duty is to ensure his people's continuity, even if that continuity exists only in scattered remnants. History will judge me harshly, I know. But history will at least have Saiyans left to do the judging. The message was dated 8 months before the destruction, during the period when his father had been actively negotiating the terms of genocide. Vegeta read it multiple times, trying to find something, anything, that might make it comprehensible, that might transform his father's logic into something resembling justification. But all he could see was rationalization, the desperate attempt of a man who'd already made his choice to convince himself it had been necessary. His father had known it was wrong, had understood the moral dimensions of what he was doing, and had proceeded anyway, wrapping cowardice in the language of duty and pragmatism. The advisor's response, when Vegeta found it several files later, was brief and cutting. "You speak of ensuring continuity as though scattered survivors constitute a people. But a people are defined by more than biology, my king. They are defined by shared culture, shared struggle, shared purpose. If we sacrifice the majority to preserve a handful, we preserve nothing but the genetics. Everything that makes us Saiyan, our history, our traditions, our collective identity, dies with planet Vegeta regardless of how many individual survivors you negotiate. You are not ensuring our continuity. You are presiding over our dissolution, then calling it leadership." There was no record of King Vegeta's response to that message. 3 weeks later, the advisor's name appeared in a casualty report, killed during a routine training exercise involving a malfunctioning gravity chamber. The investigation had been brief and conclusive: equipment failure, tragic but unavoidable, no suspicious circumstances. Vegeta's jaw clenched so hard he felt his teeth creak. Another dissenting voice, another person who'd seen through his father's rationalizations, another body added to the foundation of lies upon which the survival of the Saiyan race had been built. How many had there been? How many nobles, advisors, warriors, civilians had recognized what was happening and been silenced for their insight? The archives contained dozens of similar accidents, each one conveniently eliminating someone who'd questioned royal policy in the months leading up to the destruction. His father hadn't just collaborated with Frisia, he'd conducted a parallel genocide of his own, systematically purging anyone who might have interfered with his plans or revealed the truth to the wider Saiyan population. By the time Frisia had destroyed the planet, King Vegeta had already spent months killing anyone who might have organized resistance or exposed the betrayal. The advisor had been right. His father hadn't preserved the Saiyan people, he'd presided over their dissolution. What survived wasn't a culture or a civilization, just scattered individuals carrying the genetic markers of a dead race, performing the rituals of Saiyan identity without understanding that the substance had been hollowed out and replaced with fiction. And Vegeta was the crown prince of that fiction, the heir to a legacy that had never actually existed. Piccolo found him on the 5th day. Vegeta had stopped bothering to hide his presence in the laboratory. Subtlety required energy he no longer possessed, and honestly, what did it matter if someone discovered him excavating the ruins of his own identity? Let them watch. Let them witness the complete dismantling of the prince of all Saiyans. Perhaps there was a certain poetic justice in that. The proud warrior laid low not by combat or defeat, but by the simple truth of his own worthlessness. The Namekian appeared without warning, as was his irritating habit, materializing at the laboratory entrance with that particular expression of concern that managed to be both genuine and utterly infuriating. Vegeta didn't look up from the holographic displays, didn't acknowledge his presence, hoping the Namek would take the hint and leave him to his excavation. "Your key is wrong," Piccolo said by way of greeting, his deep voice cutting through the laboratory's mechanical hum with the precision of a scalpel. No preamble, no social niceties, just direct observation delivered with Namekian bluntness. It was, Vegeta supposed, one of the few things he appreciated about the creature. No pretense, no performance, just uncomfortable honesty. "My key is none of your concern," Vegeta responded, still not looking up, his fingers moving across the holographic controls to pull up another file, another piece of evidence in the case against his own existence. "It is when it's disrupting my meditation from halfway across the city." Piccolo moved further into the laboratory, his footsteps silent despite his size, the result of decades spent training to be invisible when desired. "You've been broadcasting distress like a beacon for days. Every sensitive fighter in West City can feel it, even if they don't consciously recognize what they're sensing." That got Vegeta's attention. His head snapped up, eyes narrowing dangerously. "I am not in distress. Right. And I'm not green." Piccolo crossed his arms, that familiar gesture of stubborn determination that meant he wasn't leaving until he'd said his piece. "Your energy signature is fluctuating wildly, oscillating between your base form power and Super Saiyan levels without any apparent trigger. Your key is shot through with something toxic, not in the physical sense, but energetically. It feels like..." He paused, searching for words, his antennae twitching as he processed what his senses were telling him. "Like poison. Like something eating you from the inside out." Vegeta wanted to deny it, wanted to lash out with sufficient venom to drive the Namekian away. But the observation was too accurate, too close to what he'd been feeling, and he found himself lacking the energy to construct an adequate defense. Instead, he simply stared at Piccolo, this being who'd spent his youth carrying the burden of his own father's sins, who'd been created for the express purpose of avenging a defeat and perpetuating a cycle of violence. "How did you do it?" The question escaped before Vegeta could stop it, raw and unguarded in a way that made him immediately wish he could retract it. But it was too late. The words hung in the air between them, a confession of weakness he couldn't take back. Piccolo's expression shifted, surprise giving way to understanding with uncomfortable speed. He'd always been perceptive, had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to read between the lines of what people weren't saying. It was what made him such an effective strategist, such a valuable ally. And right now, it made him dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical combat. "Do what?" Piccolo asked, though Vegeta suspected he already knew. "Live with it." Vegeta gestured vaguely at himself, at the laboratory, at the holographic displays still showing fragment after fragment of his father's conspiracy. "Knowing what your father was. What he did. What that makes you." Understanding bloomed fully in Piccolo's eyes, and he was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he contemplated questions he'd probably spent years wrestling with himself. When he spoke, his voice was softer than Vegeta had ever heard it, stripped of the usual gruff defensiveness. "I was created to be him," Piccolo said slowly, each word chosen with care. "Not just his son or his heir, literally created to carry his memories, his techniques, his grudges. For years, I tried to be what he'd made me to be. Tried to fulfill his purpose, carry out his revenge, finish what he'd started." He paused, shaking his head slightly. "But I failed. Not in the way I thought I would, through defeat or death, but by discovering I didn't want to be him. That I could be something else. And that was enough?" Vegeta heard the skepticism in his own voice, the desperate edge that made it less question and more plea. "You just decided to be different, and that made it true?" "No." Piccolo's response was immediate, firm. "It wasn't enough, and it wasn't simple. I carried his sins for years. still carry them, in some ways. There are people who look at me and see only his crimes, who can't separate what I've done from what he did. The weight doesn't disappear just because you decide you're different. Then how? Vegeta started, but Piccolo cut him off. You learn to carry it differently. The Namekian moved closer, his ki carefully controlled, non-threatening despite his proximity. Not as an identity, but as history. Not as a definition of who you are, but as information about where you came from. Your father's choices don't have to be your choices. His sins don't have to be your sins. Unless you let them. The words should have been comforting, should have offered some path forward through the morass of revelation and guilt, but they felt inadequate, too simple for the complexity of what Vegeta was grappling with. Piccolo hadn't been the crown prince of a dead civilization, hadn't spent decades building his entire identity on a legacy that turned out to be fiction. Their situations weren't comparable, no matter how much the Namekian wanted to draw parallels. It's not the same, Vegeta said, and he could hear the exhaustion in his own voice, the toll these days of obsessive research had taken. You were created for a purpose you rejected. I was born into a lie I believed absolutely. Everything I thought I was, everything I fought to preserve and honor, it was all built on mass graves my father helped dig. So build something else. The simplicity of Piccolo's response was almost offensive in its inadequacy. Build something else. As though identity were architecture, as though decades of conditioning and belief could be demolished and reconstructed with the ease of replacing a building. As though the foundation of lies could simply be dug out and replaced with truth, and the structure above would remain standing. You don't understand, Vegeta said, turning back to the holographic displays, unable to maintain eye contact with someone who was looking at him with such uncomfortable compassion. I don't know what I am without this. The pride, the legacy, the certainty that I was heir to something worth preserving, that's all I've ever had. Take that away, and what's left? Everything else, Piccolo said quietly. Your strength that you've earned through your own training, not inherited. Your family that you've built despite your history, not because of it. The person you've become through your own choices, separate from anything your father did or didn't do. Vegeta wanted to believe him. Wanted to accept that neat separation between inherited guilt and personal identity. Wanted to embrace the idea that he could simply choose to be someone different. But every time he tried to envision that version of himself, Vegeta without the pride of Saiyan royalty, without the burning need to honor his father's sacrifice, without the certainty of his place in a warrior hierarchy, he came up empty. There was nothing there. Just void. I should get back to my research, he said instead of responding, a dismissal that lacked the force it should have carried. He was too tired to muster proper hostility, too worn down by days of revelation to construct adequate defenses. Piccolo stood there for a moment longer, clearly weighing whether to press the issue or respect the boundary Vegeta was attempting to establish. Finally, he nodded, not acceptance, but acknowledgement. Whatever you're carrying, it's poisoning your energy, Piccolo repeated, his tone shifting back toward that gruff matter-of-factness. That's not a metaphor or spiritual observation, it's literal. Your ki is becoming toxic, not just to you but to anyone who gets close. If you don't deal with this, it's going to affect your ability to fight, to protect your family, to do any of the things you actually care about. He turned to leave, then paused at the laboratory entrance. For what it's worth, I don't think you're your father. I've fought beside you enough times to know who you are when it matters. Whatever you've discovered about your past, it doesn't change what I've seen you do, the choices I've watched you make. Piccolo's expression was unreadable, but his voice carried conviction. The question isn't what your father was. It's what you choose to be now. Then he was gone, leaving Vegeta alone with the archives and the ghosts, and the slowly crystallizing understanding that maybe Piccolo was right about one thing. The poison wasn't in the truth he'd discovered, but in his inability to process it, to find a way to exist with knowledge that contradicted everything he believed about himself. But processing required letting go, and letting go felt like death. So he turned back to the displays, to the comfortable familiarity of excavating uncomfortable truths, and let the obsession carry him forward because at least obsession was something to do. Some purpose to cling to even if that purpose was nothing more than documenting the architecture of his own demolished certainty. Goku showed up on the 6th day, and Vegeta nearly destroyed half the laboratory in his surprise. The younger Saiyan had a gift for appearing when least expected, usually at the worst possible time, with that idiotic grin and those earnest eyes that saw too much despite their owner's apparent simplicity. Vegeta had been deep in analysis of another personnel file, a scientist who'd questioned the royal mandate and subsequently died in a laboratory accident, when Goku's key signature suddenly registered at the laboratory entrance. No warning. No gradual approach. Just instant transmission, because of course Kakarot would use that technique for something as mundane as a social visit rather than reserving it for tactical necessity. Vegeta's startled reaction sent a blast of energy through the laboratory that shattered 3 holographic projectors and cracked a reinforced viewport before he managed to pull his power back under control. The data core's housing flickered but held, and Vegeta silently thanked whatever deities might exist that he hadn't just vaporized the only remaining record of truths he wasn't ready to share. Whoa! Sorry, didn't mean to sneak up on you. Goku held up his hands in that universal gesture of harmlessness, though his expression was concerned rather than apologetic. You weren't in the gravity chamber, and Bulma said you might be here. She's worried about you, Vegeta. We all are. I don't recall requesting your concern, Vegeta managed through clenched teeth, forcing his heart rate back to something resembling normal, pushing down the spike of adrenaline that had accompanied the unexpected intrusion. And I'm busy. Leave. But Goku, with the oblivious persistence that had defined their entire relationship, simply stepped further into the laboratory, his eyes taking in the scattered equipment, the multiple holographic displays, the evidence of days spent obsessively consuming information. His expression shifted from concern to something closer to alarm. Vegeta, when was the last time you slept? Or ate? You look. He trailed off, clearly searching for words that wouldn't provoke violence, finally settling on. You look worse than you did after training with Whis for 3 months straight. Your observational skills are as keen as ever, Kakarot. Now leave. Vegeta turned back to the displays, trying to dismiss Goku's presence through sheer force of will and body language. But the other Saiyan was already moving closer, his natural curiosity overriding any sense of boundaries or personal space. What are you working on? Goku leaned in, squinting at the Saiyan script scrolling across the displays. He couldn't read it, had never bothered to learn. Another example of Kakarot's frustrating relationship with their shared heritage. But he could clearly sense the emotional weight Vegeta was investing in whatever he was researching. This is Saiyan stuff, right? Is this about Planet Vegeta? The innocent question, delivered with Goku's characteristic directness, hit Vegeta like a physical blow. Yes, it was about Planet Vegeta, about the civilization that had never actually existed, the warrior culture that had been nothing more than organized brutality held together by propaganda and strategic executions. About the legacy that turned out to be lies and the father who'd betrayed them all while positioning himself as a martyr. But how could he explain that to Kakarot, who'd never known Planet Vegeta, who'd been sent to Earth as an infant and raised by humans, who'd built his entire identity divorced from Saiyan history and legacy? Goku had no attachment to the lie, no investment in the fiction of Saiyan nobility. He was simply a warrior who happened to have Saiyan biology, who'd constructed his sense of self based on personal relationships and individual choices rather than inherited legacy. It was, Vegeta realized with bitter clarity, perhaps the most enviable position imaginable. It's nothing that concerns you, Vegeta said, but the words lacked conviction, emerged hollow and defensive in ways that even Goku would recognize as deflection. And sure enough, Goku's expression shifted, that deceptive innocence giving way to a perceptiveness he rarely displayed but had always possessed when it mattered. He'd spent a lifetime learning to read opponents, to sense emotional states through energy signatures, to understand what people weren't saying as clearly as what they were. All that experience was focused on Vegeta now, and there was nowhere to hide from that kind of attention. Something happened, Goku said, not a question but a statement of observed fact. Something bad. I can feel it in your ki. It's all tangled up and angry, like you're fighting something but can't figure out how to hit it. He paused, then added with that frustrating insight that emerged unpredictably, like when Gohan was struggling with the memory of Cell. All that rage and guilt with no outlet. The comparison was uncomfortably accurate, and Vegeta found himself lacking the energy to construct an adequate deflection. Days of minimal sleep and obsessive research had eroded his usual defenses, left him vulnerable in ways he normally never tolerated. And Goku, damn him, had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to slip past Vegeta's guards when they were down. "My father," Vegeta heard himself say, the words emerging without conscious decision, bypassing all the rational objections his mind was raising. "He wasn't who I thought he was." Goku's expression didn't change to judgment, or sympathy, or any of the reactions Vegeta had been dreading. Instead, he just nodded slowly, as though Vegeta had confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Okay, what did you find out?" The question was so simple, so devoid of drama or presumption, that Vegeta found himself responding despite every instinct screaming to maintain secrecy. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the need to share this burden with someone, anyone, even if that someone was Kakarot. Or maybe it was the recognition that Goku, of all people, would neither judge him for his father's sins nor offer empty platitudes about how it didn't matter. "He made a deal with Frieza," Vegeta said, each word feeling like pulling shrapnel from a wound. "Before the destruction. Negotiated which Saiyans would survive and which would die. Spent months systematically eliminating anyone who questioned his authority, or might expose the plan. Then, when Frieza demanded complete submission, he tried to renegotiate and got us all killed anyway." The words hung in the air between them, a confession Vegeta hadn't planned to make, a secret he'd intended to carry alone. But now it was spoken, and there was no taking it back, no pretending he hadn't just revealed the fundamental lie at the heart of his identity. Goku was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful in that way that always surprised people who mistook his simplicity for stupidity. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured in ways Goku rarely bothered with. "So your dad made some bad choices. That doesn't change who you are." The response was so quintessentially Kakarot, direct, optimistic, fundamentally decent, that Vegeta nearly laughed. Nearly. Except there was nothing funny about any of this. Nothing that could be dismissed with earth-born naivety and good intentions. "It changes everything," Vegeta said, hearing the exhaustion in his own voice, the weight of days spent excavating truths he wasn't equipped to process. "My entire identity was built on being the heir to Saiyan royalty, on honoring my father's sacrifice, on preserving a legacy that I now know was nothing but lies and mass graves. Without that foundation, I don't know what I am." "You're Vegeta," Goku said, as though it were the simplest thing in the world. "The guy who's pushed me to be stronger, who protects Earth even though you pretend not to care, who's got a family that loves him and friends who trust him. Your dad's choices don't change any of that." Vegeta wanted to scream at the inadequacy of that response, wanted to make Kakarot understand that it wasn't that simple, that identity couldn't be separated from history so cleanly. But looking at Goku, this Saiyan who never needed legacy or lineage to define his worth, who'd built his entire sense of self on personal relationships and individual choices, Vegeta saw the fundamental difference between them. Goku had never carried the weight of inherited pride because he'd never been taught to value it. He'd been raised by a humble man on a backwater planet, had constructed his identity from nothing but his own experiences and choices. He had no framework for understanding what it meant to have that kind of foundational certainty stripped away, no concept of how identity could be so thoroughly entangled with legacy that removing one demolished the other. "You don't understand," Vegeta said, not accusatory but simply factual. "You've never needed to." "Maybe not," Goku admitted with that disarming honesty. "But I know what it's like to find out your past isn't what you thought. Remember when I learned about the Saiyans? About what we were bred to do, all the destroying and conquering? That wasn't easy either." "That's not the same," Vegeta started, but Goku cut him off. "I know it's not the same. But it's similar enough." Goku moved closer, his expression serious in ways he rarely displayed. "When I found out about the Saiyans, about my real parents, and what they sent me here to do, I had to decide, was I going to let that define me? Was I going to be what they intended, or was I going to be who I'd chosen to become? And you chose to ignore it entirely," Vegeta said, unable to keep the bitterness from his tone. "Chose to pretend your heritage didn't matter, that you were just some Earth warrior who happened to have a tail." "No," Goku's response was immediate, firm. "I chose to acknowledge it but not let it control me. I'm a Saiyan, and I'm proud of what I can do because of that. But I'm also Son Goku, raised by Grandpa Gohan, trained by Master Roshi, friend to Krillin and all the others. Both things are true. My heritage informs who I am, but it doesn't define me. The distinction seemed semantic to Vegeta, a linguistic trick that didn't address the fundamental problem. But there was something in Goku's expression, that certainty, that unshakable sense of self that had always been his defining characteristic, that gave Vegeta pause. Maybe that was the difference. Goku had never needed external validation to know who he was, had never built his identity on anything but his own choices and relationships. So when confronted with uncomfortable truths about his heritage, he could simply integrate them, acknowledge them without being destroyed by them. But Vegeta had spent his entire life building his identity on foundations that turned out to be fiction. Taking that away didn't leave him with alternative foundations to stand on. It left him with nothing at all. I need to finish my research, Vegeta said finally, a dismissal that was equal parts exhaustion and desperate need for solitude. He couldn't process this with Goku standing there, couldn't think through the implications with those earnest eyes watching him, waiting for some sign that everything would be okay. Goku studied him for another moment, clearly weighing whether to push further or respect the boundary. Finally, he nodded, acceptance, if not agreement. Okay. But Vegeta? When you're done with your research, when you've learned everything you need to learn. He paused, making sure Vegeta was listening. Remember that you get to decide what it means. Not your father, not history, not anyone else. Just you. Then he was gone, vanishing with instant transmission as abruptly as he'd arrived, leaving Vegeta alone with the archives and the uncomfortable echo of words that shouldn't have carried as much weight as they did. You get to decide what it means. The problem, Vegeta thought as he turned back to the holographic displays, was that he had no idea what he wanted it to mean. The old interpretation, proud heir to a noble legacy, last son of a warrior race, was revealed as fiction. But he couldn't envision an alternative that felt real, that carried the same weight and certainty. So he returned to his excavation, to the systematic documentation of every lie and betrayal, as though understanding completely might somehow show him a path forward, as though truth, however painful, might eventually transform into something resembling foundation. It was a foolish hope. But it was all he had. The dream came on the sixth night, in the brief hours when exhaustion finally overcame obsession and dragged him into something resembling sleep. He stood on planet Vegeta. But it was wrong. The colors too vivid, the architecture too sharp, everything possessed of the hyperreal quality that marked dreams. The sky burned red and gold, twin suns casting long shadows across a cityscape that was simultaneously familiar and alien. He recognized the royal district, the training grounds, the lower sectors where the majority of Saiyans had lived, but they were empty, devoid of life, monuments to a civilization that existed only in memory. And then they appeared, not gradually, but all at once, as things manifested in dreams. Thousands of Saiyans, filling the empty streets and plazas, their faces turned toward him with expressions he couldn't read. Men, women, children, warriors and civilians alike, all watching him with eyes that carried weight he couldn't quite interpret. He tried to speak, to demand what they wanted, but no sound emerged. His voice had been stolen by the logic of dreams, leaving him mute before this assembled host of the dead. A figure stepped forward from the crowd, his father, King Vegeta, but not as he'd appeared in the recorded confession. This was the father of Vegeta's childhood memories, strong and proud and utterly certain, the warrior king who'd seemed invincible to a small boy's eyes. He looked at Vegeta without speaking, his expression unreadable. Behind King Vegeta, others emerged, the advisor who'd called him a coward, the scientist who'd died in a convenient accident, the 47 protesters who'd been systematically eliminated for speaking truth, all the casualties of his father's conspiracy, all the voices that had been silenced to preserve the fiction. And behind them, tens of thousands more, the low-class warriors marked expendable, the civilians never consulted about their fate, the children who died never knowing their prince's survival had been purchased with their deaths. They didn't accuse, didn't rage or demand justice. They simply watched, their presence a weight that pressed down on Vegeta like gravity multiplied beyond endurance. The collective gaze of everyone his father had betrayed, everyone whose deaths had paved the way for Vegeta's survival. He wanted to apologize, to explain that he hadn't known, that he would never have accepted survival on those terms if he'd understood the price. But the words wouldn't come, choked off by dream logic and the growing understanding that apologies were inadequate anyway, that nothing he could say would change the fundamental fact of their deaths and his survival. His father's hand reached out, slowly, as though moving through water, and rested on Vegeta's shoulder. The touch was heavy, familiar, achingly paternal in ways that made Vegeta's chest constrict. King Vegeta leaned in, his mouth moving, speaking words that Vegeta couldn't hear but somehow understood anyway. This is what you represent. This is the weight you carry. This is the price of being my son. The crowd began to dissolve, not fading but crumbling, bodies turning to ash and dust that swirled in wind that hadn't been present moments before. King Vegeta held his gaze as he too began to disintegrate, that hand on Vegeta's shoulder the last part of him to vanish, fingers clutching with desperate strength before finally loosening and falling away into nothing. And then Vegeta was alone on a dead world, standing in the ruins of a civilization that had never truly existed, surrounded by ash and dust, and the echoes of lives spent purchasing his survival. He woke gasping, his body drenched in sweat despite the bedroom's carefully controlled temperature, his heart racing with adrenaline that had nowhere to go. Beside him, Bulma stirred, one hand reaching out automatically to rest against his arm, her touch warm and grounding even through the haze of dream logic still clinging to his thoughts. "Nightmare?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep, not quite awake but aware enough to register his distress. He couldn't speak, couldn't force words past the constriction in his throat, so he simply nodded, and she moved closer, pressing against him in that way she did when nightmares struck, offering physical comfort without demanding explanation. They lay like that for a long time, Vegeta's breathing gradually slowing to match hers, the panic of the dream fading into something more manageable. But the weight remained, that sense of thousands of eyes watching, judging, waiting to see what he would do with knowledge he'd never wanted to possess. "Whatever it is," Bulma said eventually, still not quite awake, speaking with the honesty that came from that liminal space between sleep and consciousness, "we'll figure it out together. You're not alone, Vegeta. You've never been alone here." The words should have been comforting. They were meant to be comforting, offered with genuine love and concern from someone who'd chosen to build a life with him despite everything. But all Vegeta could think was that she was wrong. He was alone in this, fundamentally and inescapably alone, because the burden he carried couldn't be shared, couldn't be divided or distributed among those who cared. This was his inheritance, his cross to bear, his father's final gift. The knowledge that everything he believed about himself was a carefully constructed lie, and the terrible certainty that there was no path forward that didn't require him to choose between comfortable fiction and unbearable truth. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't return. Instead, he lay in the darkness, feeling Bulma's warmth against his side, listening to her breathing settle back into sleep's rhythm, and contemplated the impossible question: who was Vegeta without his pride? And more terrifyingly, who did he want to be? The archives waited in the laboratory below, holding more secrets, more revelations, more pieces of the puzzle his father had left behind. But for the first time since beginning his excavation, Vegeta found himself hesitating, questioning whether complete knowledge was worth the price it demanded, because with each new truth discovered, each new layer of his father's conspiracy revealed, he felt something fundamental eroding, not just pride or certainty, but the basic sense of self that allowed a person to function, to make decisions, to exist as a coherent entity rather than a collection of conflicting impulses and inherited trauma. His father had made him heir to a kingdom of lies. And Vegeta was only now beginning to understand that accepting that inheritance meant inheriting not just the lies, but the responsibility for what came after. The question wasn't what his father had done, or even why. The question was what Vegeta would choose to do with this knowledge, this terrible gift of truth that had stripped away every comfortable certainty. But that question required answers he didn't possess, foundations he hadn't built, an understanding of himself divorced from legacy and lineage that he'd never needed to develop. So he lay in the darkness, holding on to Bulma's warmth like a lifeline, and wondered if truth, however painful, might eventually transform into something resembling peace. It seemed unlikely. But then again, everything about his existence had always been unlikely: the survival, the redemption, the family, the friendships forged despite every reason they shouldn't have been possible. Maybe one more impossibility wasn't beyond reach. Or maybe he was simply too exhausted to maintain despair, and hope was nothing more than the mind's desperate attempt to find meaning in meaningless suffering. Either way, dawn would come. The archives would still be there. And he would have to choose, continue excavating uncomfortable truths, or accept that some questions had no good answers, and learning everything didn't necessarily lead to understanding anything. The weight of certainty, he discovered, had been easier to bear than the weight of truth. But there was no going back now, only forward, into whatever came next. The morning brought no clarity, only the continuation of questions that multiplied like fractures spreading through glass. Vegeta stood under the shower longer than necessary, letting scalding water pound against his skin as though heat might somehow burn away the accumulated weight of revelation. It didn't, of course. The water simply ran over him, indifferent to his crisis, returning to the drain carrying nothing but soap and the illusion of cleansing. When he emerged, Bulma had already left for her lab, an early meeting, according to the note she'd left on the bathroom mirror, written in that hurried script that somehow remained elegant despite its speed. Call me if you need anything. I mean it. B. The assumption that he might need something, that he might reach out, felt alien. He'd built his entire identity around self-sufficiency, around needing nothing and no one, around the warrior's pride that demanded absolute independence. But that pride, he was coming to understand, had been built on foundations as false as everything else. He dressed mechanically, pulled on training clothes out of habit rather than intention, and found himself standing in the apartment's main living space, uncertain of his next move. The gravity chamber called to him from muscle memory, decades of routine suggesting he should train, should lose himself in physical exertion until thought became impossible. But the idea of entering that space, of performing those familiar katas, of drawing on the pride and certainty that had always fueled his transformations, felt not just hollow but fraudulent. How could he train to honor a legacy that had never existed? How could he draw power from pride that was revealed as nothing more than a carefully constructed delusion? The laboratory waited below, holding the rest of the archives, the remaining secrets his father had left scattered through encrypted files and classified records. Part of him wanted to return immediately, to finish what he'd started, to excavate every last fragment of truth until nothing remained hidden. But another part, the part that had woken from nightmares of ash and watching eyes, recognized that more information wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. The problem wasn't lack of knowledge. It was the inability to process what he'd already learned, the failure to construct any coherent sense of self that could exist alongside these revelations. He was standing at the window, staring out at West City's morning traffic without really seeing it, when his scouter, an old model he kept more from habit than necessity, chirped with an incoming message. He'd almost forgotten he still had the thing, a relic from his days in Friesia's service, modified by Bulma years ago to interface with Earth's communications networks. The message was brief, sender unmarked, message body containing only coordinates and a timestamp set for this afternoon. No context, no explanation, just location and time delivered with the presumption that he would understand the significance. He didn't. But the coordinates were local, somewhere in the mountains north of West City, far enough from civilization to ensure privacy but close enough for quick travel.